Christianity began as a persecuted, decentralized movement in first-century Judea. Within 300 years, it became the official, centralized state religion of the Roman Empire. The early communities gathered in households. They were guided by groups of equal elders, entirely devoid of a professional priestly class, and deeply rooted in the theological vocabulary of the Hebrew Bible. By the 4th century, that structure had vanished. The church was now ruled by a single Roman emperor, managed by an exclusive priestly caste, and defined by complex Greek philosophical creeds. Historians often frame this transition as a natural maturation, a sapling growing into a mighty tree. But the historical record shows something different. This period represents a systematic institutional inversion. Through 4 traceable structural deviations, the Post-Apostolic Church actively overwrote its original New Testament blueprint. The stakes of this historical record are severe. Most of what modern institutional Christianity considers baseline orthodoxy is built on this 4th century Roman architecture, rather than the 1st century foundation it claims to represent. The New Testament documents reveal a consistent governance structure. Local congregations were led by a plurality of equal elders. The Greek terms episkopos, meaning overseer, and presbyteros, meaning elder, are used interchangeably across multiple texts to describe the exact same group of people. This plural structure reflected a direct mandate from Jesus. In Matthew 20, he explicitly forbade his followers from adopting the governance style of the Gentiles, where rulers exercise authority and dominate their subjects. He mandated a model of servant leadership, where no single individual lords over the community. The first major structural deviation appears around AD 110. Ignatius, the bishop of Antioch, began passionately writing letters advocating for a single monarchical bishop to be elevated above the other elders. He argued this centralized authority was necessary to protect local churches from heretical teachings. Ignatius instructed congregations to regard the bishop as the Lord himself, presiding in the place of God. This solved a short-term pastoral problem by creating a permanent theological contradiction. It placed a human intermediary into the position that the New Testament strictly reserved for Christ. This compares the original blueprint with the post-apostolic outcome. Jerome admitted that creating a bishop hierarchy was human custom, not divine appointment. This concentrated authority required a new formal distinction between leaders and ordinary believers. In the 3rd century, Cyprian of Carthage formalized this divide. He imported the Old Testament Levitical system, the very system the early church believed Jesus had fulfilled and ended, back into Christian ministry, arguing the bishop functioned exactly like the Aaronic high priest. Cyprian's framework systematized a sacerdotal or priestly professional caste. The Greek word kleros, originally referring to the entire inheritance of God's people, was restricted to this ordained elite. The rest of the congregation became the laos, passively people. The apostolic writings, particularly the book of Hebrews, argued that Christ's ultimate sacrifice abolished the need for human priestly mediation. By re-erecting a human mediating priesthood, the post-apostolic church directly contradicted that core doctrine, permanently restricting the believer's direct access to God. The 3rd structural deviation was cultural and legislative. The institutional church systematically stripped itself of its Hebraic roots to align more closely with the surrounding Gentile Roman society. Early theologians justified this separation through replacement theology. Ignoring the Apostle Paul's explicit warning in Romans 11 against Gentile arrogance, they claimed ethnic Israel had been permanently rejected and that the Gentile church was now the sole, true Israel. This theological framework remained largely academic until the reign of Emperor Constantine. Constantine weaponized this supersessionism, translating his personal hostility toward Judaism into formal imperial law. In an edict promulgated in October 315, Constantine officially criminalized Jewish proselytization of Christians. The legal text explicitly referred to Judaism as an abominable sect. 10 years later, at the Council of Nicaea, Constantine successfully pushed to decouple the Christian calculation of Easter from the Jewish Passover calendar. In his letter following the council, he stated the church ought to have nothing in common with the detestable company of the Jews. This timeline illustrates how rapidly the anti-Jewish legislation compounded, culminating at the Council of Laodicea in 363. Canon 29 explicitly outlawed biblical Sabbath rest, declaring anyone who maintained the practice a heretic. Through this legislative force, the Church dressed Jesus in Gentile clothing. By severing the living connection to the Hebrew calendar and customs, they made the original faith unrecognizable to the people from whom it had emerged. This legislated de-Judaization established the theological and legal scaffolding that justified centuries of institutional anti-Semitism. The final structural shift required an entirely new mechanism of authority, the elevation of unwritten ecclesiastical tradition and imperial councils over the plain text of the written scriptures. The first-century apostles preached a relational theology. They understood Jesus through the Hebrew concept of shaliach, or divine agency, where the Son functionally represented the Father who sent him. The 4th century Church discarded this framework in favor of Greek philosophical metaphysics. At the Council of Nicaea, the Church attempted to define the exact nature of God using imported Platonic and Aristotelian vocabulary. They settled on the term homoousios, meaning of the same substance, a philosophical concept entirely absent from the biblical text. The Roman emperors convened these ecumenical councils to enforce political and theological unity across the empire. Instead, by demanding rigid agreement on complex metaphysical formulations, the councils consistently generated massive, permanent schisms. This diagram shows the fragmentation. Nicaea resulted in decades of conflict. Ephesus alienated the Church of the East, and Chalcedon permanently severed the Oriental Orthodox communions. The council machine replaced a straightforward message of faith with an unbiblical philosophical barrier, requiring converts to navigate Greek ontological categories like hypostasis and ousia. By demanding adherence to these rigid definitions, the institutional church actively hindered its own mission. They erected a conceptual wall that alienated monotheistic populations, limiting witness to Jewish communities and later emergent Islamic populations. Over the course of 3 centuries, the Christian community traded the simplicity of its apostolic foundation for a rigid institution governed by an exclusive magisterium. The costs of this exchange are documented in the historical record. The Church sacrificed the participatory priesthood of all believers. It deliberately erased its own Hebraic foundation, and it lost a universally communicable, non-philosophical Messiah. These 4th century Roman structures did provide the organizational coherence necessary to survive the eventual collapse of the Western Roman Empire, but the evidence demonstrates that those very structures explicitly contradicted the New Testament blueprint they claim to be defending. This raises a critical question for modern believers. Are these systemic historical losses recoverable, or is institutional Christianity permanently bound to its imperial Roman architecture? For centuries, various movements have attempted to peel back these accretions. From the Protestant Reformation's push to recover scriptural authority to modern house church and Messianic Jewish movements, there is a persistent drive to recover pieces of that original first-century foundation. True fidelity to the early church does not mean reflexively defending 4th-century imperial traditions. It requires the historical honesty to recognize those traditions as measurable deviations and the courage to begin building again on the documented apostolic blueprint.